A millionaire was mistaken for an IT technician by the new secretary and fell madly in love. Before we dive into the story, leave a comment letting us know which city you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Everyone. Alice Evans didn't have time to panic. It was her first day as an executive assistant. Things were already going wrong. The computer system at Foster Enterprises was down. Employees were running around like crazy. A millionaire was mistaken for an IT technician by the new secretary and fell madly in love. Before we dive into the story, leave a comment letting us know which city you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Everyone. Alice Evans didn't have time to panic. It was her first day as an executive assistant. Things were already going wrong. The system at Foster Enterprises was down. Employees were running around like crazy. The server's down, someone yelled. Nothing works. We've lost all the files. I didn't back up the reports, Alice said, rubbing her temples. Great first morning. It already feels like I'm in charge of the Titanic. She grabbed the phone and dialed IT support. Busy line, she said. Trying again. Nothing. Wonderful. We're stuck in a digital apocalypse. She grumbled, slamming the phone onto the desk. It was right at that moment that a well-dressed man walked into the office. He had on an excellent suit, shiny shoes, a serious expression. He looked calm, watching the chaos around him with his arms crossed. As if this were just a normal Tuesday. Alice didn't waste time. Finally. You took way too long, she said, marching up to him. The system is down. It's a mess. Fix this now. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. Excuse me. Alice stomped her foot. Excuse me. Nothing I said, she said. Fix it. She emphasized each word. Before this company burns down and I get fired before I even find out where the bathroom is. He laughed a little, looking more amused than worried. What if I told you I can't fix it? Alice sighed loudly. Oh great. First day. They send me a tech guy who doesn't know what he's doing. Look. I've already wasted 5 minutes of my life with you. If you don't. He let out a small laugh, looking more entertained than worried. What if I told you I can't fix it? Alice sighed loudly. Oh. Great. First day. They send me a clueless tech guy. Look. I've already wasted 5 minutes of my life with you. If you don't want to work, at least pretend to care. The man seemed to enjoy this even more. So is that what I'm supposed to do? Pretend to care? Yes. Work on that computer like you're solving the cure for the century. Got it. He shook his head with an ironic look. All right. Here we go. Alice. She shoved him into the chair as gently as she would shove a refrigerator. Hurry up. The man adjusted his suit, sighed theatrically, started typing something on the keyboard. Alice leaned over to the side, watching his every move. Wow. Slow. Are you typing with just one finger? You need to be patient. You need to be fast. This isn't an IT course for seniors. The man stopped typing and looked at her. Am I really being asked to work faster by you? Yes. What do you think this is? Brain surgery. It's just a computer. Click. Fix it. Let's move on. He sighed. Once more. She feigned suffering and returned to her computer. 5 minutes later. She finished. Almost finished. My grandfather could have repaired this before taking his nap. He looked away from the computer and stared at her. Clearly enjoying himself. Was your grandfather in IT? No. Even he would know you're stalling. The man actually laughed this time. Impatient. Alice grabbed the phone again. Hello. Security. The IT guy needs to be escorted out because he can't fix a basic system. The man raised his hands in surrender. Okay. Okay. Calm down. Look. Watch this. He pressed a single key and suddenly all the screens went back to normal. The entire office breathed a sigh of relief. Hallelujah. Alice clapped her hands. Finally. That wasn't so hard. Was it? He stood up slowly. Adjusting his wristwatch. That was interesting. Alice sighed in relief. Great. Now you can go up to the next floor and fix their system. The man raised an eyebrow and his smile grew. Who said I work here? Alice froze. The sentence hung in the air for a few seconds. Her brain took a moment to process it. It was at that exact a man in a gray suit suddenly appeared in the room. Hurried and a bit sweaty. Sir. Everyone's waiting for you in the board meeting. Alice blinked. Board meeting. The information exploded in her mind like fireworks. She froze. Her eyes wide as if she'd been shocked. The man in front of her wasn't the IT guy. He was Arthur Foster. The new CEO of the company. The silence in the office was deafening. Everyone in the room realized the disaster before Alice did. Arthur slowly turned to her. Crossed his arms. Tilted his head slightly. A sly smile spread across his face. Alice felt her spine freeze. So. Miss Evans. Are you satisfied now? Alice felt the world crumble. Her face turned as red as a tomato. Her hands started sweating. Her mind screamed, I'm fired. In flashing neon. Arthur chuckled quietly. Clearly enjoying himself. Alice. On the other hand. Wanted to dig a hole and disappear. The silence in the room was deafening. Alice could feel the sweat running down her neck. Her heart was pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. She blinked. Hoping by some miracle reality would return. Would she disappear and wake up safe in her bed? Far away from this nightmare? But no. There was Arthur Foster. The CEO of the company. Standing right in front of her. She had just treated him like an incompetent technician. Yelled at him. Practically dragged him to fix a computer. She was in big trouble. Arthur was still looking at her with amusement in his eyes. Arms crossed as if he were savoring the moment. Miss Evans. You look surprised. Alice swallowed hard. Her brain seemed to have frozen just like the computers earlier. The employees around her were very quiet. Some tried to hide behind their screens. While others exchanged glances. Almost saying. She's done for. It was nice knowing her. Arthur's assistant. Still waiting by his side. Seemed a little uncomfortable. Maybe because he had just witnessed one of the worst corporate blunders in history. Arthur on the other hand. Arthur seemed genuinely entertained. He tilted his head slightly. You know. I've never received such a direct order in my entire career. Bossy. Alice opened her mouth. No words came out. Her whole body screamed for her to do something. Anything. To get out of this mess. But the best she could manage was a nervous, completely inappropriate laugh. Ha ha. Ha. Ah. Great. Now. On top of being humiliated. She looked like a crazy person laughing to herself. Arthur raised an eyebrow. Was that an attempt at a laugh or a short circuit? Both. He gave a half ha-ha. Ah. Great. Now. On top of being humiliated. She looked like a crazy person laughing to herself. Arthur raised an eyebrow. Was that an attempt at a laugh or a short circuit? Both. He gave a half smile. Interesting. Alice felt her stomach churn. She needed to get out of there. Disappear into thin air. Be swallowed by the floor. Anything would be better than staying under Arthur Foster's sharp gaze. She tried to gather herself. Even though her legs felt like jelly. Look. Mr. Foster. I honestly didn't know who you were. Arthur let out a fake sigh of regret. And to think I spent 5 minutes being treated like an incompetent. In turn, my ego will never be the same. The room filled with quiet coughs and sniffles. Clearly. The employees were trying not to laugh. Alice felt her face get even hotter. I'm so sorry. It was an honest mistake. How was I supposed to know? Arthur took a step forward. His intense gaze making Alice want to run away. Do you yell at all the new hires around here? Was I a special case? I was just trying to fix the problem. Alice tried to explain, Arthur said. Pretending to think for a moment. It was efficient. I'll give you that. Rude. Efficient. Alice opened her mouth to defend herself. Was interrupted by a loud cough. Arthur's assistant glanced at his watch. Nervously. He said, Sir. The directors are waiting in the meeting room. Arthur nodded calmly. Kept his eyes on Alice. Ah. Yes. The meeting, Alice said. Trying to calm herself. Maybe he was in a hurry and would forget. About her, maybe this was just a bad dream. She'd wake up soon. But then Arthur smiled slowly and thoughtfully. Miss Evans. You're going to come with me. Alice stopped moving. What? I said you're coming with me. He looked around. Since you like giving orders so much. I want you to personally explain to the directors what happened with the system. The whole office held its breath. Alice felt her knees weaken. She was about to walk into a high-level meeting with the CEO to explain the mistake of the day. Suddenly. Selling coconut water on the beach seemed like a tempting option. Alice followed Arthur through the hallways. Feeling the employees' stares boring into her back. Sir. I really don't think it's necessary for me to go to this meeting. Arthur kept walking. Alice bit her lip to stop herself from complaining. They entered the elevator. A moment. There was an awkward silence. Until Arthur turned his face slightly toward her. Oh. Just so you know. You're the first person to drag me into fixing a computer. Alice? She covered her face with her hands. Please stop reminding me of that, Arthur laughed. Not that I would want to. The meeting room was huge and filled with directors and businesspeople. When Arthur entered, everyone immediately stood up. Alice felt her spine stiffen. Arthur walked to the center of the room. Calm as if nothing had happened. Gentlemen. Before we begin. Our new assistant. Miss Evans. Would like to share how she solved the system issue this morning. 20 pairs of eyes looked at her at once. Alice swallowed hard. She thought of 1,000 ways to get out of this situation. Make up an excuse. Run away. Pretend she was crazy. There was no way. She took a deep breath and said, "I'm sorry. I gave the wrong order." There was a long, silent moment. Arthur just raised an eyebrow. Alice squeezed her eyes shut tightly. "Actually, I mistook the CEO of the company for an IT technician and made him fix the computer." There was a dry sound. Alice opened her eyes. One of the directors dropped his pen because he was so shocked. Arthur just smiled. Alice shrank in her chair. One of the directors cleared his throat and tried to hide his laugh. Arthur turned to Alice, clearly enjoying the moment. "Miss Evans. You know how to make an entrance at a company." Alice felt like her soul was leaving her body. What was next? A fire in a month of jokes. Arthur crossed his arms, thinking, "I wonder if I should reconsider your position. Maybe I should transfer you to IT support, since you have so much experience with orders there." The directors couldn't hold back. Their laughter was no longer funny. Alice wanted to leave. Next to her, Arthur Foster seemed more interested than ever. That was scary. Alice felt Arthur's eyes on her, while the meeting room still echoed with the quiet laughter of the directors. She wanted to disappear. Vanish. Run to the mountains. Raise goats. She would rather leave than stay. She couldn't leave. She was stuck in that chair, staring at the CEO, whom she had mistaken for a technician. She had ordered the technician to fix a computer. Arthur still seemed to be enjoying the whole thing. He turned to the directors and clapped his hands together, wrapping up the moment casually. "All right. Now that everyone had enjoyed their morning entertainment, now let's get back to work." The directors quickly composed themselves, adjusting their ties and trying to regain their seriousness. Alice hid behind her notebook, hoping no one would bring up the disaster again. Of course, Arthur Foster wasn't going to let her off that easily. Everyone had enjoyed their morning entertainment. Now let's get back to work. The directors quickly composed themselves, adjusting their ties and trying to regain their seriousness. Alice hid behind her notebook, hoping no one would bring up the disaster again. Arthur Foster wasn't going to let her off that easily. He looked directly at her, crossed his arms, said, "Oh, Miss Evans. After the meeting, come to my office. We need to talk." That was it. It was over. Alice felt her soul leave her body. She was going to be fired. She knew it. After all the effort she'd put into getting this job, she'd managed to throw it away in less than a morning. He looked at her directly, crossed his arms, said, "After the meeting, Miss Evans. Come to my office. We need to talk." That was it. It was over. Alice felt her soul leave her body. She was going to be fired. She knew it. After all the effort she'd put into getting this job, she'd managed to throw it away in less than a morning. Congratulations to her. Alice spent the entire meeting not paying attention to anything. The charts, the financial reports, the company's growth projections, everything was a blur in her mind. She just stared at the clock, watching the time tick by, until her inevitable meeting with Arthur. With every minute that passed, Her anxiety only grew. She imagined all the possible scenarios. Arthur would yell at her and fire her on the spot, that he'd ask HR to prepare her termination letter and escort her out of the building, that he'd stay silent and just point to the door. A real final blow to her dignity. Each option seemed worse than the last, and the worst part, Arthur. He didn't seem to want to end her suffering. In fact, he was completely calm. As if he'd forgotten she even existed. Which made everything even more terrifying when the meeting finally ended. Alice stayed behind, waiting for everyone to leave the room. Her heart was in her throat. Arthur stood up calmly, grabbed his documents. She imagined the different ways Arthur might react. He might yell at her and fire her right then and there. He might ask Human Resources to prepare her termination letter and escort her out of the building. He might stay silent and just point to the door. Each option seemed worse than the last. The worst part. Arthur glanced at her and said, "Let's go. Evans." Alice closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "May the employment gods have mercy on me." And she followed Arthur to his office. Arthur Foster's office was something out of a luxury catalog. Dark wooden furniture. Shelves full of impeccably organized books. A panoramic view of the city. In the center, Arthur sat in a chair like a king on his throne. Rested his elbows on the desk. Gestured for Alice to sit in the chair across from him. She slowly obeyed. Feeling like a child called to the principal's office. For a few seconds, he just stared at her in silence. Alice tried to smile. "So Mr. Foster, you wanted to talk to..." She imagined all the possible ways Arthur would react to her. He might yell at her and fire her right then and there. He might ask Human Resources to prepare her termination letter and escort her out of the building. He might just stay silent and point to the door. Each option seemed worse than the last. The worst part was Arthur. Arthur raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Foster. Funny. Earlier, I was just the IT guy and the guy who needs to work faster." Alice felt her face turn red. Honest mistake." Arthur let out a low laugh. "Sure. It was fun. I'll admit." Alice blinked. Surprised. "Fun? Yeah. It's not every day someone gives me orders in my own company." Alice sighed. She imagined all the possible ways Arthur would react. He would yell at her and fire her on the spot. He would ask HR to prepare her termination letter and escort her out of the building. He would stay silent and just point to the door. Each option seemed worse than the last. The worst part. Arthur. With relief. Maybe he wasn't that angry after all. Then Arthur leaned slightly forward and smiled. However, the relief disappeared immediately. "We need to talk about your future here." Alice swallowed hard. "My future?" Arthur nodded. "Yes. Your attitude today showed me something interesting." Alice held her breath. "Am I impulsive?" "You're stubborn. Bossy. Have no filter." "Great," Arthur laughed. "And you're quick. Determined. Not easily intimidated." Alice's eyes went wide. Is a compliment, a statement? She wasn't sure if she should feel flattered or offended. Arthur interlaced his fingers and watched her with interest. "I need someone like that by my side." Alice almost fell off her chair. "Sorry. What?" "I'm promoting you." Alice froze. Time seemed to stop. "You want to promote me?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because you entertained me." Alice was stunned. "That's your reason?" "Also because I think you have potential." She eyed him suspiciously. "So, you want to keep me around just to laugh at me?" Arthur didn't say yes or no. He didn't deny it either. Alice narrowed her eyes. So. What kind of promotion is this? Arthur smiled. Starting today. You'll be my personal assistant. Alice swallowed hard. Personal as in directly to you. Exactly. Alice felt her hands sweat. She already had enough trouble being the assistant to the directors. Now she'd have to deal with Arthur Foster directly. She tried to find a way out. What if I say no? Arthur raised an eyebrow. You want to say no? Alice bit her lip. That a serious question or a trick to intimidate me? Arthur smiled. Both. Alice took a deep breath. What could she do if she refused? She might lose her job. If she accepted, well, she'd have to deal with a sarcastic, unpredictable boss every day. For some bizarre reason, the idea didn't sound so bad. She looked at Arthur and made her decision. All right. I accept. Arthur smiled with satisfaction. Great. Alice felt a chill run down her spine. She was absolutely sure that she imagined all the ways Arthur might react. He might yell at her and fire her right then and there. He might ask human resources to prepare her termination letter and escort her out of the building. He might stay silent and just point to the door. The last option was the worst. Arthur's decision was going to change her life. She just didn't know if it would be for better or for worse. Alice left Arthur's office with weak legs. She wasn't sure if she had just received a promotion or a death sentence. Her brain was still trying to process what had just happened. In less than a day, she had yelled at the company's CEO. She thought he was an IT guy. Told him to work faster. Somehow this led to a new role right next to him. Let's have some fun with people who only read the comments. Type McDonald's in the comments. Only those who got this far will understand. Now, let's continue the story. Her heart was still racing as she walked down the hallway. What exactly does a personal assistant to the CEO do? Get coffee? Organize his schedule? Or worse, stand by his side all the time, dealing with his orders and sarcastic personality? She walked into the administrative office like she was carrying a secret that the government didn't want to be made public. Everyone looked at her as soon as she walked in. People whispered in the corners. Some laughed quietly. Others stared at her like she was a ghost of a former employee who had died for saying something wrong to Arthur Foster. I heard you survived, said one of the employees. Pulling the state secret. Everyone was staring at her the moment she walked in. People whispered in the corners. Some laughed quietly. Others stared at her like she was a ghost of a former employee who had died for saying something wrong to Arthur Foster. I heard you survived, one of the employees said. Pulling the chair next to hers. Tell me. How was your execution? Alice slumped into the chair. Dropped her shoulders. Let out a defeated sigh. He didn't fire me. The entire office went silent for a moment. Then a wave of whispers and murmurs spread. What? A woman's eyes widened. Everyone saw what happened and a woman sat down in the chair next to Alice's. How was your execution? She asked. Alice slumped into the chair. Dropped her shoulders. Let out a sigh. He didn't fire me, she said. The office went silent for a moment. Then, a wave of whispers and murmurs spread. What? A woman's eyes widened. Everyone saw what happened in the meeting room. Not only was I not fired. Alice sighed. I was promoted. The commotion was immediate. Stifled screams. People holding onto their desks. A man even dropped his coffee mug. One of the older employees approached Alice, looking at her like she was some kind of scientific anomaly. Mr. Foster promoted you, he said. Straight to his personal assistant. This time, the commotion was replaced by a terrified silence. Alice frowned. Okay. What's the problem? A woman with her hair tied in a tight bun and a serious posture looked at Alice like she was about to face a minefield. You've just been thrown into the lion's den. A guy who seemed a bit younger leaned forward. Mr. Foster never had a personal assistant. Alice blinked. He has assistants. Of course. The woman continued. But personal assistants? No. He fires them all before even considering the possibility. Alice felt a chill run down her spine. So why me? No one knew the answer. One thing was certain, she was in trouble. Before she could process this new information, the phone on the desk beside her rang. The receptionist answered. Stayed silent for a moment. Then looked directly at Alice. Miss Evans? Alice swallowed hard. Yes. Mr. Foster is calling you to his office. The whole office held its breath. Good luck. Someone said quietly. Alice wanted to scream. She slowly got up. As if she were going to a place where something bad was going to happen. Walked toward the CEO's office. Each step felt very difficult. When she reached the door, she took a deep breath 3 times. Ran her hand through her hair to look somewhat presentable. Knocked. Come in. The deep voice echoed from inside. She turned the doorknob. Opened the door. Found Arthur Foster sitting behind his desk. Going through some papers. He didn't even look up when she walked in. Alice? You moved closer. With each passing second. You felt more nervous. You called for me. Finally. Arthur lifted his gaze. Alice felt a chill run down her spine. He had that intense, analytical look that seemed to read her every thought without saying a single word. Yes. Sit down. Alice settled into the chair and tried not to look too tense. Arthur twirled a pen between his fingers. Like he was considering something. You start officially today as my personal assistant. She forced a smile. Good. I was worried I wouldn't have anything to do. Arthur raised an eyebrow. Sarcasm on the first day? Brave Alice stood up straight. Sorry. It's just the shock. Arthur put the pen down on the desk and leaned slightly forward. You'll have direct access to my schedule. My meetings. My trips. Anything else I need you to take care of for me. Your job is to make sure I don't waste time on unnecessary things. Alice blinked. So basically, I need to make sure you never get upset about anything. Exactly. She took a deep breath. Sounds difficult. Arthur smiled. It will be. Alice felt like crying. Then Arthur pulled out a black folder and slid it across the desk to her. Your first challenge. She picked up the folder and opened it. Looking over the papers inside. What's this? A charity dinner. I'm one of the speakers. You need to organize everything. Alice looked at the papers. Seeing the guest list. The location. The schedule. This is in 3 days. Yes. You're giving this to me now. Yes. Alice felt a wave of panic. Mr. Foster. Arthur raised a hand to stop her. Challenges are part of the job. If you can handle this without me having to worry about it, then I'll know I made the right choice. Alice closed her eyes for a second. Trying not to freak out. She had to plan a high-class event in 3 days without missing a single detail. Great. She stood up, holding the folder like it was a cement brick. Okay. I'll take care of it. Arthur smiled slightly. Satisfied. Great. Alice turned to leave. Before she reached the door, she heard his voice again. Oh. Alice. She slowly turned around. Yes. Arthur rested his chin on his hands, smiling that usual enigmatic smile. You're more interesting than I expected. Alice felt a strange shiver run down her spine. She didn't stop to think about what he meant. She just left the room as fast as she could because she already had enough problems. Alice spent the next few hours running around the office. She called suppliers, confirmed RSVPs, organized speeches, tried to figure out how she had ended up in this situation. She knew one thing: surviving her first day as Arthur Foster's assistant was a victory. Now, she had to survive the rest of the week. Alice left Arthur's office holding the black folder like it was a bomb ready to explode. Profile charity dinner. In 3 days. No experience. No room for mistakes. Of course. Nothing in her life was ever simple. She walked down the hallway, feeling the eyes of her colleagues on her. Everyone was curious about how she was still employed. Some were even whispering, trying to guess what had happened in the CEO's office. Alice didn't have time for gossip. She needed to figure out how to organize an event of this size without causing a disaster. When she got to her desk, she opened the folder and started. She looked over the documents. The guest list included important business people, politicians, celebrities. The venue was a fancy hotel in the city center. The menu needed to be chosen. The decorations were adjusted. The speeches were reviewed. She felt a tightness in her chest. What's going on now? A familiar voice asked from beside her. Alice looked up at the woman with the tight bun. The same one who had warned her that working with Arthur was like stepping into a lion's den. He gave me 3 days to organize a high-profile charity dinner. She replied. Annoyed. The woman's eyes widened. So he's already started the testing phase. Alice frowned. What does that mean? Mr. Foster likes to test people. He throws impossible challenges to see how far they can go before they break. Alice blinked. So he's literally waiting for me to fail? The woman shrugged. Or for you to surprise him? It depends on how you handle it. Alice slammed the folder shut with a snap. Great. Now, I have even more pressure. She glanced at the clock. If she stayed there feeling sorry for herself, she wouldn't even have time to make a mistake. She decided her first step was to figure out what was already in place and what needed to be done. She picked up the phone and started calling suppliers, trying to negotiate services, check contracts, make sure everything was on track. The first call was to the company handling the decorations. She felt even more pressure. She looked at the clock. If she stayed there feeling sorry for herself, she wouldn't even have time to make a mistake. She decided her first step was to figure out what was already in place and what needed to be done. She picked up the phone and started calling suppliers, trying to negotiate services, check contracts, make sure everything was on track. The first call was to the company handling the decorations. After 4 failed attempts, someone finally answered. Hello. Hi. This is Alice Evans, Mr. Arthur Foster's personal assistant. I'm reaching out to confirm the details for the charity dinner decorations. Oh. Sure. Sure. We have a bit of a problem. Alice felt a chill. What kind of problem? Well, the venue didn't approve the installation of the setup we planned. We need to redo the concept. Alice narrowed her eyes. And when were you planning on letting me know about? She felt even more pressure. She looked at the clock. If she stayed there feeling sorry for herself, she wouldn't even have time to make a mistake. She decided her first step was to figure out what was already in place and what needed to be done. She picked up the phone and started calling suppliers, trying to negotiate services, check contracts, make sure everything was on track. The first call was to the company handling the decorations. After this, now Alice closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. Okay. Can you redo it and send me the new proposal today? Actually, it would take at least a week. Alice almost threw the phone out the window. Are you telling me that? 3 days before the event. I have no decorations. The silence on the other end was the confirmation she needed. Okay. I'll handle it. She hung up and massaged her temples. Breathe. Alice. You got this. She picked up the phone again and started calling other suppliers. All of them were either fully booked or charging an outrageous price. After half an hour, she managed to find a company willing to take on the job in record time. It would be expensive. Better than nothing. Meanwhile, other problems began popping up. The menu still wasn't settled. Arthur's speech wasn't ready. The invitations were late. The band cancelled. With each new problem, she felt more pressure. Alice felt overwhelmed. In the middle of the afternoon, she went to Arthur's office to update him on the challenges. When she walked in, he was going through reports. Reports. Mr. Foster. Arthur looked up. What do you have for me? Alice pulled out a notebook. The decorator quit. The band cancelled. The menu isn't approved. The invitations still haven't been sent. And oh, I haven't. She felt even more pressure. She looked at the clock. If she stayed there feeling sorry for herself, she wouldn't even have time to make a mistake. She decided her first step was to figure out what was already in place and what needed to be done. She picked up the phone and started calling suppliers, trying to negotiate services, check contracts, make sure everything was on track. The first call was to the company handling the decorations. After sleeping since I started dealing with this. Arthur rested his chin in his hands. A small smile appeared at the corner of his lips. Basically, it's all a disaster. Alice let out a dramatic sigh. Basically. Arthur was silent for a moment, just watching her. Alice started feeling uncomfortable. Was he waiting for her to lose it? To quit? To her surprise, he picked up the phone and made a call. George. I want the dinner invitations on my desk by the end of the. She had a lot on her plate. She glanced at the clock. If she stayed there feeling sorry for herself, she wouldn't even have time to make a mistake. She decided her first step was to figure out what was already in place and what needed to be done. She picked up the phone and started calling suppliers, trying to negotiate services, check contracts, make sure everything was on track. The first call was to the company handling the decorations. After no excuses, he hung up and looked at Alice. The rest you can handle. Alice blinked. That's it. Were you expecting a motivational speech? I was hoping for at least a good luck charm. Arthur tilted his head slightly. You don't need luck, you need coffee. Alice opened her mouth. Then closed it. Okay. That's the first thing you've said today that actually makes sense. Arthur chuckled softly. You're doing better than I thought. Alice felt a small flicker of pride. So. You don't think I'm going to fail miserably? Do you? Not yet. Wow. What an inspiring vote of confidence. Arthur just smiled. Clearly enjoying himself. Alice sighed and left the room. Ready to continue the battle. In the next 2 days. She worked non-stop. Running back and forth. Fixing the final details. Making sure every piece was in the right place. On the last day. She finally managed to finalize the menu. Is everything ready? Arthur asked. Smiling. Yes, Alice replied. Raising an eyebrow. If you had failed. I would have already gotten angry calls. Really? Arthur asked. If you had failed. I would have already gotten angry calls. What an inspiring vote of confidence, Alice said. Clearly enjoying herself. In the next 2 days. She worked non-stop. Running back and forth. Fixing the final details. Making sure every piece was in the right place. On the last day. She finally managed to finalize the menu. Replace the band. Approve the alternative decorations. When the time for the event finally came. Alice barely had a chance to catch her breath before slipping into an elegant dress and rushing to the venue to make sure everything was in order. She checked every detail as if her life depended on it. In the middle of the crowd. She saw Arthur arrive. He looked flawless as always. His eyes. He was looking for something when he saw her. He raised a glass of champagne and gave her a mysterious look. Alice walked over to him. Expecting him to make a sarcastic comment. Is everything in order? He asked. Yes. Everything is perfect. Arthur smiled. I had no doubts. Alice raised an eyebrow. Really? If you had failed. I would have already gotten angry calls. Alice let he saw her and raised his champagne glass. He gave her a strange look. Alice walked over to him. She thought he would make fun of her. Is everything in order? He asked. Yes. Everything is perfect. Arthur smiled. I had no doubts. Really? If you had failed. I would have already called to get angry. Alice let out a laugh. Does this mean I passed your test? Let's see if you survive the next one. Alice shivered. She was sure her life would never be dull next to Arthur Foster. Alice had barely had time to breathe. Ever since she took on the impossible task of organizing the charity dinner in just 3 days. Her life had turned into a whirlwind of phone calls. Does this mean I passed your test? Arthur asked. Leaning in slightly. Let's see if you survive the next one. Alice shivered. She was sure her life would never be dull next to Arthur Foster. Ever since she took on the impossible task of organizing the charity dinner in just 3 days. Her life had turned into a whirlwind of phone calls. Last-minute confirmations. Unexpected crises. She had barely slept. Surviving on coffee. Her sanity was hanging by a thread. Now. On the day of the event. Everything was ready. The hotel ballroom was flawless. Decorated with sophisticated luxury. The tables were elegantly set. The lighting was perfect. Even the napkins had been folded identically down to the last detail. Alice walked through the room, checking every detail. The chef made sure dinner would be served on time. They knew the band was preparing for the event. Guests were starting to arrive. She felt a bit relieved. She didn't want to celebrate just yet. She wanted to make sure everything went smoothly. She wore a nice black dress for the occasion. Her shoes were already hurting her feet from walking back and forth. She took the tablet to check the guest list when she heard a deep, clear voice behind her. "Well, you've made it this far." Alice turned around and saw Arthur Foster. He stood there, looking at the room with a careful eye. He was wearing a very tight tuxedo, as if he had been born in it. His hair was perfectly styled. He held a glass of champagne as if he had all the time in the world. Alice crossed her arms. "It's not over yet. There's still time for something to go wrong." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "An optimistic view. Realistic." Alice corrected him. Arthur took a sip of his drink and tilted his head slightly, studying her, with that look that always made her feel uncomfortable. "You looked tired." Alice let out a short laugh. "Is that a compliment?" "Just an observation. I'll take it as a recognition of my effort." Arthur gave a small smile. "If that makes you happy." Alice sighed and went back to checking her task list. Before she could finish, she was interrupted by a hurried waiter. "Miss Evans. We have a problem in the kitchen." Alice felt her heart race. "What now?" "The head chef is freaking out. He said he got a last." Alice asked the chef to change the main dish. "The chef said he would cancel the order." Alice closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "Just 2 minutes," she said. She looked at Arthur, who just smiled. "Good luck," he said. Alice hurried out and into the hotel kitchen, where she found the chef gesturing frantically, surrounded by confused assistants. The chef said, "I spent 3 days planning this menu. Now someone wants me to change everything. No. No. This." Alice said. Alice raised her hands, trying to calm things down. "Okay. Let's fix this." "Who made the request?" One of the assistants stepped forward, hesitantly. It was one of the VIP guests. "He's allergic to the main dish." Alice felt a weight lift off her shoulders. "So why don't we just prepare an alternative for him?" The chef's eyes widened. "Alternative? I don't have extra ingredients." Alice looked around, spotted a tray of salmon and pointed, "What is that?" "Smoked salmon for the appetizers." "Perfect. We'll make a special dish for him with salmon. The rest of the menu stays the same." The chef crossed his arms, thinking about the idea. That could work." Alice forced a smile. "Great. So let's stop freaking out and make this happen." The chef huffed, started giving orders to the assistants. Alice left the kitchen feeling exhausted, satisfied till she solved another problem before it became a disaster. She returned to the ballroom and found Arthur exactly where she left him, watching the scene as if it were a private show. "Did you save the dinner?" Alice sighed. "The chef wanted to blow everything up. I convinced him to stick to the plan." Arthur laughed. "I'd say you've got a talent for handling crises." "I'd say I'm too young to have an ulcer." "Here we are." Arthur raised his glass to her. "To your first big event." Alice hesitated. She took a champagne glass from a passing waiter and toasted with him. "May it not be the last." Arthur took a sip, then looked straight at her. That depends on you. Alice felt a slight shiver at his tone. Before she could respond, an important guest arrived. She spent the rest of the night making sure everything went according to plan. Arthur raised his glass to her, saying, "To your first big event." Alice hesitated. She took a champagne glass from a passing waiter and toasted with him. "May it not be the last." Arthur took a sip, then looked straight at her. "That depends on you." Alice felt a slight shiver at his tone. Before she could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of an important guest. She spent the rest of the night making sure everything went according to plan. She watched Arthur's speech, dealt with small surprises, tried to ignore the strange feeling that somehow he was always watching her. When the event finally ended, guests began to leave. Alice felt like she could finally breathe. She took off her shoes under the table and threw herself into a chair in the corner of the empty room. Her feet ached. Her head throbbed. She had made it. Arthur walked over, hands in his pockets. Looking at her with a playful gleam appeared in his eyes. "So, how do you feel?" Alice sighed. "Like I ran a marathon in high heels." Arthur smiled. "You did a good job." Alice's eyes widened. Was that a compliment? It was a fact. Alice rolled her eyes. "You're incapable of giving a direct compliment." "Huh?" Arthur just smiled. "The important thing is that you understood." She shook her head. "Too tired to argue." "Right. Now." Arthur took out his phone. He typed something quickly. Then he put it back in his pocket. "You can rest now. I need you in my office tomorrow at 8 in the morning. We have a new agenda to discuss." Alice groaned. "Tomorrow? Don't you ever rest?" "No." She sighed, grabbed her shoes, struggled to get up. "All right. I'm going home before you give me another impossible task." Arthur watched her for a moment before responding. "Good night, Alice." She blinked. It was the first time he had called her by her first name. Alice wasn't sure what to think. She nodded and left. When she got into the taxi, she looked in the rearview mirror and saw Arthur still standing at the hotel entrance. Watching her with that mysterious expression she still couldn't figure out. She didn't know what Arthur Foster really wanted. She knew one thing: working with him would be exciting. Now, all she wanted was a bed. A pillow. To forget that her life had been turned upside down. Since she met that man, her life had been very chaotic. Alice woke up to the alarm ringing for the third time. Her body protested the idea of getting up. She remembered Arthur's words. "Tomorrow at 8 in the morning. I want you in my office." She groaned. Rolled over in bed. Felt every muscle in her body ache. After the madness of organizing that charity dinner, all she wanted to do was sleep. She wanted to sleep more. She knew Arthur Foster wouldn't accept excuses. She got out of bed and went to the bathroom. She splashed cold water on her face and tied her hair into a bun. She chose a dark blazer and dress pants, trying to look professional. She wanted to avoid making Arthur doubt her competence. She grabbed a coffee. She hurried to the office. When she walked in, she saw that several people were looking at her. It had been a few days since she had become the topic of office gossip. Now it seemed even worse. As soon as she got to her desk, she found a pile of documents waiting for her. She sighed and started organizing everything when her phone rang. "Alice Evans. You're late." Alice almost dropped the phone. She quickly glanced at the clock. It was 8:03. Okay. 3 minutes late isn't late. She replied. Upset. If you were in an important meeting and showed up 3 minutes late, would you still be considered on time? Alice sighed. I'm on my way. She hurried up and walked to Arthur's office. When she entered, he was sitting at his desk, flipping through some papers. His eyes lifted to her as soon as she closed the door. Good morning, Mr. Foster. Depends on how this morning goes. Alice sat down across from him, crossing her legs, waiting for him to say something other than intimidating phrases. Arthur took a black folder and moved it to her. This is your new task. Alice opened the folder and found a series of internal documents. Contracts. A tight schedule of meetings. And what exactly do you need me to do with this? You're now part of my strategic team. I need you to organize and review these contracts, making sure everything aligns with our guidelines before the investor meeting on Friday. She blinked. Wait. Does this mean I'll be attending that meeting? Arthur gave a half smile. You've already shown that you can handle pressure. I want to see how you do in the real business world. Alice felt a chill. She wasn't sure if she should feel honored or terrified. Both feelings were possible. She closed the folder and took a deep breath. Okay. I'll take care of it. Arthur, he leaned forward, his elbows on the table, interlaced his fingers. Aren't you going to ask why I'm giving you this responsibility? Alice looked him in the eye. I don't need to. Do you want to see how far I can go before I break? Arthur chuckled softly. Smart. Alice stood up and grabbed the documents. Smart would have turned down this job. You didn't. Not yet. Arthur watched her as she walked out of the room. You won't turn it down? He asked. She rolled her eyes and closed the door. In the following hours, she studied the contracts. They were long, filled with technical terms and complex clauses. Her head throbbed. She wasn't going to give up. If Arthur wanted to test her, Smart would have turned down this job. You didn't. Not yet. Arthur watched her as she walked out of the room. You won't turn it down, he said. She rolled her eyes and closed the door behind her. In the following hours, she dove into the contracts. They were long, filled with technical terms and complex clauses. Her head throbbed. She wasn't going to give up. If Arthur wanted to test her, then she would show him she was up for the challenge. Before she knew it, it was almost 7 in the evening. The office was beginning to empty. She still had a lot to review. Her stomach growled loudly, reminding her she hadn't eaten anything since breakfast. She stood up, stretched her body, grabbed her purse. She was about to leave when she heard Arthur's voice behind her. Do you usually work? He asked. This late? Alice turned around and saw Arthur standing in the doorway of his office, watching her with curiosity. I need to finish this. You could have done it tomorrow. I'd rather finish it now. Arthur walked over and looked at the documents on her desk. Did you find any inconsistencies in the contracts? A few small details that could be used against the company in case of a lawsuit. Alice turned around and saw Arthur standing in the doorway of his office, watching her with curiosity. I needed to finish this. You could have done it tomorrow. I'd rather finish it now. Arthur walked over and looked at the documents on her desk. Did you find any inconsistencies in the contracts? A few small details that could be used against the company in case of a lawsuit. I made some notes. Arthur picked up one of the pages and reviewed the marks she had made. Impressive. Alice smiled. Was that a compliment? Don't get used to it. Why are you still here? Don't you have a fancy mansion to go back to? Arthur stared at her for a moment. Then shrugged. Maybe I just like seeing how far you can go. Alice scoffed. If that's the goal, you'll need patience. Arthur gave a half smile. We'll see. He turned to leave. Stopped at the door. Are you hungry? Alice furrowed her brow. I asked if you're hungry. She hesitated. Yes. Why? Arthur glanced at the clock. I'm going to dinner. You can come and tell me more about those inconsistencies in the contracts. Alice stared at him, trying to figure out if he was he serious or just messing with her. Is this a test, if you want to think of it that way? Go for it as long as there's food involved. Whatever. Arthur smiled and nodded. Let's go. Alice grabbed her things and followed him out of the office. She still wasn't sure where this partnership was going. One thing was clear, working with Arthur was interesting. Arthur Foster was like a power game. She had to make sure she wasn't the first to lose. Alice followed Arthur down to the building's underground garage, where he unlocked a black sports car with a simple click. The vehicle looked like it came straight out of a luxury catalog. Alice swallowed hard as she realized she'd never been so close to a car worth that much. She hesitated before getting into the passenger seat. Taking in the smell of leather and advanced technology around her, Arthur slid in next to her with his usual calm and started the engine, which purred like a wild animal. I hope you don't drive like a maniac, Alice said, fastening her seatbelt as if her life depended on it. On it. Arthur gave her an amused look before smoothly accelerating. I drive better than you read contracts. Alice rolled her eyes but didn't reply. In the first few minutes of the drive, the silence between them felt comfortable. The city passed by, the lights from the buildings reflecting in the glass. For the first time that day, Alice felt she smiled. He turned to leave. But before he could exit, he stopped at the door and asked, Are you hungry? What? She asked. Her brow furrowed. I asked if you're hungry, he repeated. She hesitated. Then she said, yes. Why? He asked, glancing at the clock. I'm going to dinner. You can come and tell me more about those inconsistencies in the contracts. Alice stared at him, trying to figure out if he was like she could breathe. The car stopped in front of a fancy restaurant downtown. Alice looked out the window, trying to hide her shock as she realized that place was way beyond what she could afford in a whole month's salary. Large glass doors reflected the sophisticated lighting inside. Customers dressed in impeccable clothes passed through. He smiled and said, We'll see. He turned to leave. Before exiting, he stopped at the door and asked, Are you hungry? Alice. I asked if you're hungry. She hesitated. Yes. Why? Arthur glanced at the clock. I'm going to dinner. You can come and tell me more about those inconsistencies in the contracts. Alice stared at him, trying to figure out if he. The entrance, where a valet in a stylish uniform was already waiting to take Arthur's car keys. She turned to him. Suspicious. This is the kind of place where a salad costs more than my rent. Isn't it? Arthur gave a small smile, clearly enjoying himself. Is that a problem? Alice scoffed. For me. Yes. You. Clearly not. Arthur. He smiled and said, "We'll see." He turned to leave. Before exiting, he stopped at the door and asked, "Are you hungry?" Alice furrowed her brow. "What did you mean?" "I asked if you're hungry." She hesitated. "Yes." "Why?" Arthur glanced at the clock. "I'm going to dinner. You can come and tell me more about those inconsistencies in the contracts." Alice stared at him, trying to figure out if he got out of the car without responding, and handed the keys to the valet, who smiled and gave a slight bow before getting into the vehicle. Alice got out from the other side, adjusting her blazer and feeling completely out of place in a place where even the air seemed expensive. Once inside, they were immediately greeted by the matriarch. Well, he smiled and said, "We'll see." He turned to leave, stopped at the door. "Are you hungry?" Alice asked, her eyebrows furrowed. "What did I say?" she asked, hesitating. "I asked if you're hungry." She hesitated, then said, "Yes." "Why?" Arthur glanced at the clock. "I'm going to dinner. You can come and tell me more about those inconsistencies in the contracts." Alice stared at him, trying to figure out if he was a dressed-up gentleman who, upon seeing Arthur, smiled politely. "Mr. Foster. It's a pleasure to welcome you back. Your table is ready." Alice raised an eyebrow, watching the scene. "Do you have a reserved table here? Like it's your second home?" Arthur simply followed the matriarch without answering. Alice rolled her eyes and followed him to a reserved table in a corner of the restaurant, away from the curious gazes of the others. Guests. As soon as they sat down, a waiter immediately appeared with a bottle of wine. "Your usual wine, Mr. Foster." Alice crossed her arms, watching as the waiter poured the glasses. "Impressive. You're treated like royalty here." Arthur picked up the glass and swirled the liquid slowly before taking a sip. "Untreated like royalty everywhere." Alice let out a short, sarcastic laugh. "You really have an indestructible ego, don't you?" Arthur just smiled. "It's not ego, it's reality." Alice shook her head and grabbed the menu. As soon as she opened it, she felt a slight panic when she saw the prices. Oh. Of course. A simple steak costs half my salary. How wonderful. Arthur leaned slightly over the table, watching her with an amused look. "Choose whatever you want." Alice furrowed her brow. "Suspicious. Are you paying? I brought you here. Didn't I?" "Yes. You've also made me do impossible challenges before. I'm not sure I trust your sudden kindness." Arthur chuckled softly and took another sip of wine. "I just want to hear more about the problems with the contracts." Alice let out a dramatic sigh and closed the menu. "Fine. I warn you. If you're rude, I'll order the most expensive thing on the menu." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "Is this, you've also thrown me into impossible challenges before. I'm not sure I trust your sudden kindness." Arthur chuckled softly and took another sip of wine. "I just want to hear more about the inconsistencies in the contracts." Alice let out a dramatic sigh and closed the menu. "Fine. I warn you, if you're rude, I'll order the most expensive thing on the menu." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "Is this how you always negotiate?" "Always." The waiter returned. Alice ordered a pasta dish, resisting the temptation to choose something outrageously expensive just to tease Arthur. He, on the other hand, ordered a steak without even looking at the menu. After the waiter left, Alice pulled out one of the contracts she had brought in her bag and spread it out on the table. "All right. Let's get to the point. The Millennium Holdings contract has a clause that, if misinterpreted, could allow them to back out of the agreement without paying a penalty." Arthur furrowed his brow, took the document, reviewed it. "You're right," Alice said, smiling. "Of course I am," Arthur replied, looking at her. The intensity in his gaze made Alice feel a little uncomfortable. "You like being right?" Arthur said, half-joking that smile. "As if you were enjoying the conversation more than the information itself." Dinner arrived. Alice sighed when she saw the beautifully arranged dish in front of her. "This looks too good to eat." Arthur calmly cut a piece of his steak. "Are you going to compliment the food before you try it? That doesn't seem like your style." Alice rolled her eyes and picked up her fork. "Have you noticed that you love making comments about my smile as if you are enjoying the conversation more than the information itself?" Dinner arrived. Alice sighed when she saw the beautifully arranged dish in front of her. "This looks too good to eat." Arthur calmly cut a piece of his steak. "Are you going to compliment the food before you try it? That doesn't seem like your style." Alice rolled her eyes and picked up her fork. "Have you noticed that you love making comments about my style?" Arthur just smiled, as if there was no need to confirm anything. They ate in silence for a few minutes. Alice was surprised to find that the food was truly amazing. After a long, exhausting day, that dinner felt like an unexpected reward. Once they finished, Arthur leaned back in his chair and watched Alice for a few seconds before speaking. "Do you really think I'm trying to test you?" Alice wiped her lips with the napkin before answering. "I'm sure of it." Arthur tilted his head slightly. "What if I told you I'm just curious to see how you handle pressure?" Alice crossed her arms. "That's exactly what a test is." Arthur let out a low laugh. Alice realized that for the first time he seemed genuinely relaxed. "You're interesting, Alice Evans." She raised an eyebrow. Was that a compliment? A statement of fact? She sighed. "You need to learn how to compliment people without smile as if you are enjoying the conversation more than the information itself." Dinner arrived. Alice sighed when she saw the beautifully arranged dish in front of her. "This looks too good to eat." Arthur calmly cut a piece of his steak. "Are you going to compliment the food before you try it? That doesn't seem like your style." Alice rolled her eyes and picked up her fork. "Have you noticed that you love making comments about my?" Arthur just smiled. The waiter returned with the bill. Alice watched as Arthur paid without even blinking. When they left the restaurant, the cold night air made Alice shiver. Arthur took the car keys from the valet and opened the door for her. Alice got in, still processing the night. As Arthur drove, she noticed that, despite the air of superiority he always carried, tonight had shown a different smile as if you are enjoying the conversation more than the information itself. Dinner arrived. Alice sighed when she saw the beautifully arranged dish in front of her. "This looks too good to eat." Arthur calmly cut a piece of his steak. "Are you going to compliment the food before you try it? That doesn't seem like your style." Alice rolled her eyes and picked up her fork. "Have you noticed that you love making comments about my side of me? Something more relaxed, less rigid." When he stopped in front of the building where she lived, Alice hesitated before getting out of the car. "Should I thank you for dinner?" Arthur glanced at her sideways. If you want to. Great. Thanks for the absurdly expensive dinner and for not making me pay half my salary for it. Arthur chuckled softly. Good night, Alice. She got out of the car and walked into the smile as if you are enjoying the conversation more than the information itself. Dinner arrived. Alice sighed when she saw the beautifully arranged dish in front of her. This looks too good to eat. Arthur calmly cut a piece of his steak. Are you going to compliment the food before you try it? That doesn't seem like your style. Alice rolled her eyes and picked up her fork. Have you noticed that you love making comments about my building? Still feeling his gaze on her. She reached her apartment and collapsed onto the couch. Exhausted. She was right about one thing, working with Arthur Foster was a real power game. Somehow she was starting to enjoy it. Alice woke up feeling the weight of the previous day on her shoulders. The dinner with Arthur Foster was still echoing in her mind. She turned over in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out why she was bothered by his comments that he seemed to be analyzing her. As if he was always trying to predict her next move. It wasn't just a power game. Also some sort of constant test. She got up, went to the bathroom, splashed cold water on her face. She needed to focus on what really mattered, her work. The dinner had been an unexpected break from her chaotic routine. Now it was time to get back to the pace. She put on a pair of smile as if you are enjoying the conversation more than the information itself. Dinner arrived. Alice sighed when she saw the beautifully arranged dish in front of her. This looks too good to eat. Arthur calmly cut a piece of his steak. Are you going to compliment the food before you try it? That doesn't seem like your style. Alice rolled her eyes and picked up her fork. Have you noticed that you love making comments about my black dress pants and blue blouse? She grabbed her purse and left the house, determined not to let Arthur's provocations get to her. When she arrived at the office, she noticed that the looks were even more intense than before. People were whispering, exchanging curious glances. Every time Alice passed by, the room would fall silent for a few seconds before the murmurs started again. She frowned and walked over to her closest co-worker. Smile as if you are enjoying the conversation more than the information itself. Dinner arrived. Alice sighed when she saw the beautifully arranged dish in front of her. This looks too good to eat. Arthur calmly cut a piece of his steak. Are you going to compliment the food before you try it? That doesn't seem like your style. Alice rolled her eyes and picked up her fork. Have you noticed that you love making comments about my... What's going on? It feels like I'm some kind of lab experiment being analyzed. The woman hesitated for a moment. Then she smiled a little. Well, there are rumors, Alice said, crossing her arms. What kind of rumors? The co-worker looked around before whispering in Alice's ear. You and Miss Storr had dinner together last night. Alice blinked, surprised. Really? Oh my God. Seriously? Now I can't even have dinner without people making up rumors. The woman shrugged. You know how people are. Mr. Foster never takes anyone to dinner. Alice shook her head, grabbed the papers on her desk, headed for Arthur's office. This was ridiculous. People had too much time to gossip and not enough time to work. She knocked on the door and heard his deep voice say, "Come in." Alice opened the door and found Arthur, as usual, busy with paperwork. He looked up at her and a slight smirk appeared on his lips. He looked more annoyed than usual. Alice threw the folder of documents on his desk. Thanks. That's exactly what I needed to hear. Arthur picked up the folder. He opened it calmly. Is something bothering you? Yes. The fact that the whole office now thinks that last night's dinner was some kind of romantic date. Arthur raised an eyebrow. Why does that bother you? Alice stared at him, unable to believe it. Oh. Really? Are you enjoying this? Arthur closed the folder, leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms. He had a clearly provocative look on his face. Maybe a little. Alice sighed and sat down in the chair across from him. Arthur interlaced his fingers and watched her closely. I need your help. You usually solve everything on your own. I can usually handle it. I need you to help me put an end to this gossip. Arthur tilted his head slightly. How exactly would I do that? I don't know. Maybe spread another rumor or deny any involvement. Or maybe say there's someone else in your life. Arthur chuckled softly. What people say doesn't change. Alice. Anything for me. But it changes things for me. Arthur looked at her for a moment. Then his smile faded a little. You're worried it'll hurt your credibility? Alice sighed. Of course. I worked hard to get this job. I don't want people thinking I'm here for any reason other than my skills. Arthur lightly tapped his fingers on the desk. Thinking. All right. Let's put an end to this. Alice blinked. Really? Yeah. He picked up the phone and made a quick call. Karen. Please send an internal memo reminding everyone that personal relationships at work shouldn't be a topic of speculation. That any gossip without proof will be taken seriously. Alice's eyes widened. Wait. You just made this a company rule. Arthur hung up the phone and smiled. You wanted to solve the problem. Didn't you? Alice let out a nervous laugh. Oh my God. People are going to hate me. Arthur turned his attention back to the documents and casually said. It's better for them to be scared of you than to disrespect you. Alice watched him for a moment, trying to figure out if he was really protecting her or just enjoying the situation. Probably both. Before she could keep thinking about it, Arthur stood up and grabbed his jacket. We have a meeting in 30 minutes. I want you there. A meeting with who? A potential new investor. And why should I be there? Arthur walked over to her and stopped beside her. Arthur leaned down slightly to look her in the eyes. Because I want to see how you handle a tough opponent. Alice felt a shiver run down her spine. Opponent? Arthur smiled. You'll understand. Alice followed him into the meeting room, feeling the rising tension in the air. She had a feeling that this meeting would be much more than just a business negotiation. They entered the room and Alice immediately recognized the man sitting at the table. He was tall and well dressed nicely, with a friendly smile and a thoughtful look. He had the same energy as Arthur, as if he was used to being the boss in any room. Arthur shook the man's hand firmly. David Lancaster. It's good to see you again. The man smiled. Always a pleasure. Then his eyes turned to Alice. And who's this? Arthur glanced briefly at Alice before answering. My personal assistant. Alice extended her. She took his hand, keeping her posture strong. Alice Evans, David said, smiling. I've heard of you, Alice said, raising an eyebrow. The halls of Foster Enterprises talk a lot. You seem to have made quite an impact. Alice kept her smile. A hint of irritation stirred inside her. Arthur pulled out a chair to sit down and looked. David looked bored. As usual. Let's get straight to the point. The meeting started. Alice quickly understood what Arthur meant by tough opponent. David was smart, asking questions and trying to control the conversation. Arthur, however, remained calm. He answered each argument with precision and stayed in control, without showing any signs of stress. Alice watched closely, paying attention to every tactic. When David posed a tricky question about the contracts, Alice jumped in without thinking. In Clause 43, there's a detail that protects our interests in this situation. You must have noticed it when you reviewed the documents. David looked at her, surprised for a moment, then smiled. Interesting. Arthur looked at Alice with a satisfied smile. The meeting continued until David finally stood up and shook Arthur's hand. Always an intriguing game negotiating with you, Arthur said. The feeling is mutual, David replied. David looked at Alice one more time and then left. I'll be keeping an eye on you, Miss Evans, he said. I hope so, Alice replied. As they left the room, Arthur looked at her with a playful glint in his eyes. You handled him well, he said. I guess I'm. Alice smiled. Learning from the best. Arthur just laughed. Alice then realized that she was actually starting to enjoy this game. She walked out of the meeting, her mind racing. The encounter with David Lancaster had been intense. She could still feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The first time, she felt like she was truly part of the world of business strategy and subtle manipulations. What was most intriguing was the way Arthur observed her, studying her. Alice felt like she was being tested by Arthur, who seemed to be observing her reactions. She didn't like feeling like an experiment. She also enjoyed the challenge. When they returned to the office, Arthur went straight to his office. Before entering, he looked back at Alice and said, "Good work today." Alice blinked, surprised. Is that a compliment? Arthur smiled slightly. Take it however you like. Before she could respond, he entered his office. The office closed the door. Alice stood still for a few seconds, trying to understand the strange feeling that had washed over her. It was a mix of pride and confusion. Working for Arthur Foster was always challenging. Now she realized that she was starting to enjoy his dynamic. She went back to her desk and collapsed into the chair, massaging her temples. Her inbox was full. Before opening any messages, she heard hurried footsteps and saw her co-worker approached with a look of pure excitement. What's going on now? Alice asked, already bracing herself for another absurd rumor. You were in the meeting with David Lancaster. Alice rolled her eyes. Wow. The gossip spreads fast around here. The woman leaned over the desk. How was it? They say he's one of the toughest negotiators to deal with. Alice sighed. It was intense. Arthur knew exactly how to handle everything. He never lost control for a second. And you? Alice gave a half smile. I think I'm getting the hang of it. The worker smiled, clearly impressed. Went back to her desk. Alice looked at her screen and finally started answering the emails. Her mind was still stuck on the meeting. Arthur didn't show up throughout the afternoon, which was unusual since he always made provocative comments. Today, he seemed distant and too busy to tease her. When the clock hit 7 in the evening, Alice realized she was still in the office with just a few other people around. The building was almost empty. She grabbed her things and walked hesitantly toward Arthur's office. She thought about knocking, decided to just peek through the partially open door. He was inside. Sitting at the desk. Reading a document. "You work too much," she said. Walking in without being invited. Arthur looked up. Surprised. He didn't expect this from her. The woman who stayed late to review contracts smiled and sat down. "Fair enough," said Arthur, "but unlike you. I'm not obsessed with work." He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "I like what I do. Maybe you just don't know how to do anything else." Arthur looked at her for a moment. Then smiled. "You're always trying to figure me out. I won't deny it. You're a mystery." Arthur studied her intensely. For a few seconds. Before standing up and grabbing his jacket. He said, "Let's get out of here." Alice blinked. Surprised. "You're right. We've worked enough. It's time for a break." Alice hesitated. "Is that an invitation?" "More like an order. Actually." She laughed and grabbed her things. "At least you're honest about it." They left the office together. This time Arthur didn't take her to a fancy restaurant. He drove to a low. The bar had a key bar with dim lighting and background music. It was a place Alice never would have imagined him going. "You surprised me," she said as they sat down at a table in the back. Arthur ordered 2 drinks and smiled. "How so?" he asked. "I expected something more fancy." "You think I only go to fancy restaurants?" "Until now. That was the impression." Arthur chuckled softly. "Surprising people as part of the game?" Alice picked up her drink and took a sip. "You play the game a lot," Arthur said. He looked at her. Her eyes showed amusement. "Also something else. And you're learning to play too." Alice. She wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a warning. They stayed at the bar for another hour. Talking about business challenges and some other things. Alice noticed that Arthur, away from the office, was more relaxed. He was still provocative and sharp. Different. "Let's play a little game. Those who only read the comments. Type Coca-Cola in the comments. Only those who made it this far will understand. Now. Let's get back to the story." When they left the bar, the cold night air hit them. Alice wrapped her arms around herself to protect from the chill. Arthur looked at her for a moment. Then took off his jacket and put it on her. She looked at him. Surprised. "That was unexpected," she said. "You were shivering." She pulled the jacket tighter around her body and gave a half smile. Arthur looked at her for a moment before taking off his jacket and draping it over her shoulders. She looked at him. Surprised. "That was unexpected," she said. "You were shivering." She pulled the jacket tighter around her body and gave a half smile. "So you have a gentleman's side." Arthur just smiled without replying. They walked to the car. The silence between them was comfortable. Filled with something new. Something Alice wasn't quite sure how to name. When he stopped in front of her building, Alice hesitated before getting out. She turned to him and tried to ignore the strange feeling in her chest. "It was a good night." Arthur nodded. "Yeah. It was," Alice said. She opened the door. Before getting out, she looked at him one last time. "You're a mystery," she said. "Arthur Foster," he replied. She smiled. "Liked solving mysteries." She laughed. Got out of the car. Walked into the building. As she went up to her apartment, she felt oddly light. Something was changing. She didn't know where. The next morning, Alice woke up feeling strangely refreshed. Despite the events of the past week, the unexpected dinner, the night, she smiled. Her eyes showed that she liked solving mysteries. She laughed, got out of the car, walked into the building. As she went up to her apartment, she felt oddly light. Something was changing. She just didn't know yet where it would take her. The next morning, Alice woke up feeling strangely refreshed. Despite the twists and turns of the past week, the unexpected dinner and the night out with Arthur didn't feel overwhelming. On the contrary, she felt a renewed energy. She quickly got ready and left the house, determined to maintain her professional demeanor, even with the growing closeness between her and Arthur. After all, she still worked for him. Any involvement outside of work would be problematic for her reputation and her mental well-being. When she left the office, she didn't feel overwhelmed. On the contrary, she felt full of energy. She quickly got ready and left the house. She was determined to act like a professional, even though she was growing closer to Arthur. After all, she still worked for him. Any relationship outside of work would be problematic for her reputation and her mental well-being. When she arrived at the office, she immediately felt the eyes on her. After Arthur's internal memo about office gossip, the tension among the staff seemed to have increased. Everyone seemed more careful with their whispers. Alice could still feel the curious stares. She took a deep breath and ignored it, walking straight to her desk. There were emails to answer, meetings to schedule, a new corporate event in the works. She was determined to focus on upon arriving at the office. She immediately felt the eyes on her. After Arthur's internal memo about office gossip, the tension among the staff seemed to have increased. Everyone seemed more careful with their whispers. Alice could still feel the curious stares. She took a deep breath and ignored it, walking straight to her desk. There were emails to answer, meetings to schedule, a new corporate event in the works. She was determined to focus on work and not on the man who had been complicating her life lately. Of course, Arthur wasn't going to make things easy. "Good morning, Miss Evans." His deep voice sounded from behind her. Alice closed her eyes for a second before turning around. "Good morning, Mr. Foster." Arthur watched her for a moment before crossing his arms. "Looks like you slept well." Alice narrowed her eyes. "And what does that mean?" Arthur gave a small smile. "Normally, you come in looking like you." She had survived a hurricane. "Not today." Was that a compliment? Just an observation. Alice controlled her eyes. "So, what do I owe the honor of this early visit?" Arthur handed her a document. "I need you to review this for the investor meeting tomorrow. There are points I want you to look over and bring suggestions." Alice took the document, flipping through it quickly. "You really like giving me extra work." "Huh." Arthur smiled. "I like to see what you're capable of." Alice let out a sigh. A dramatic sigh. "Of course. I'm an experiment for you." Arthur didn't deny it. 8 o'clock in my office. I want to hear your thoughts." Alice shook her head, grabbed a coffee, got to work. The day went by fast. Before she knew it, it was almost time for the meeting with Arthur. She reviewed the documents one more time before grabbing her notes and heading to his office. She knocked on the door and walked in. Arthur was standing with his back to her, looking out. Upon arriving at the office, Alice felt like everyone was staring at her. After Arthur shared the details of the office gossip, the tension among the staff seemed to have increased. Everyone seemed more careful with their whispers. Alice could still feel the curious stares. She took a deep breath and ignored it, walking straight to her desk. There were emails to answer, meetings to schedule, a new corporate event in the works. She was determined to focus on the view through the large glass window of the city. "You know, you could have a worse view," Alice commented, closing the door. Arthur turned around and smiled. "It's one of the perks of the job," he said. Alice sat down and placed the documents on the desk. "I've gone over everything. There are 3 clauses that need adjusting. Here are my suggestions." Arthur took the papers and looked them over, occasionally glancing at her as if he were processing something beyond the written words. "Good work, Alice." Alice raised an eyebrow. "What? You heard me. Arthur likes to compliment me. I need to mark this date." He just smiled and rested his elbows on the desk, interlacing his fingers. "Now that we've dealt with the boring stuff, I have another matter." Alice frowned. "Another impossible task?" "Not exactly." Arthur paused for a moment before continuing. "There's a gala in 2 days. I want you to come with me." Alice blinked, surprised. "What?" Upon arriving at the office, she immediately felt the eyes on her. After Arthur shared the details of his internal memo about office gossip, the tension among the staff seemed to have increased. Everyone appeared to be more careful with their whispers. Alice could still feel the curious stares. She took a deep breath and ignored it, walking straight to her desk. There were emails to answer, meetings to schedule, a new corporate event in the works. She was determined to focus on the event, which was a strategic business opportunity. "But I need someone by my side who understands the ongoing negotiations." "So, you want me to go as your assistant?" Arthur gave a slight smile. "And as my +1? Alice froze for a few seconds. "Is this a problem for you?" Arthur asked with his usual teasing tone. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. She knew she couldn't refuse without a solid reason. He had given a professional justification. Any refusal would upon arriving at the office. She immediately felt the eyes on her. After Arthur shared the details of the office's gossip, the tension among the staff seemed to have increased. Everyone seemed more careful with their whispers. Alice could still feel the curious stares. She took a deep breath and ignored it, walking straight to her desk. There were emails to answer, meetings to schedule, a new corporate event in the works. She was determined to focus on her work. "Fine," she finally said. "But I get to choose my dress." Arthur chuckled quietly. "As long as you look presentable. I have no problem with that." "Does that mean I can go in sweatpants?" "Not even in your worst nightmares." Alice laughed and grabbed the documents before leaving the room. In the following 2 days, she focused on work, trying not to think too much about the event. It was impossible to ignore the looks from the employees. Every time Arthur walked by her, he acted like they weren't about to attend one of the company's biggest events together. On the night of the event, Alice looked at herself in the mirror, feeling strangely nervous. She had chosen a long black dress, elegant but not overdone. Her hair was in a low bun. She wore light makeup. She sighed before grabbing her purse and heading downstairs to meet Arthur, who had insisted on picking her up. When she stepped out of the building, she found Arthur leaning against his car. Dressed. He looked at her in a perfect tuxedo and said, "Impressive." Alice raised an eyebrow. Was that a compliment? Arthur smiled. Yes. She blinked. Surprised. Got into the car without saying anything. The drive to the event was silent but comfortable. When they arrived, Alice realized how grand the event was. A luxurious ballroom. Guests dressed impeccably. Cameras capturing every detail. Arthur got out of the car first and offered his hand to Alice, who hesitated for a moment before accepting it as she stepped out. She saw that several people were staring at them. "This isn't a good idea," she said quietly. Arthur smiled. It was too late to back out now. Alice stood up straight and walked with him into the ballroom. The night had just begun. She felt sure that this event would change everything. Alice took a deep breath as she walked across the huge ballroom beside Arthur. The air felt full of luxury, with big chandeliers hanging from the ceiling and fancy tables spread out around the room. The quiet buzz of the guests mixed with the soft sound of live music filled the air. She felt every eye on her. For the first time, she realized that being with Arthur Foster wasn't just about working for him. He guided her with ease, as if they were used to attending events together. Alice, however, was aware of the weight of the moment. The rumors in the office were already intense. Now appearing publicly with Arthur would only fuel the speculation even more. "Relax," Arthur murmured, leaning slightly toward her. "You're so tense. It looks like you're about to run away." Alice gave a half smile. She smiled and looked at the crowd around them. It wasn't every day that she was the center of attention without meaning to be. Arthur gently took her arm and led her toward a group of businessmen. "Just focus on what you do best," he said. "Work." She raised an eyebrow. "Challenge me," Arthur said, smiling. Alice didn't have time to respond. They were already standing in front of a small group of important people. Smile. Not taking her eyes off the crowd around them. "It's not every day that I'm the center of attention without meaning to." Arthur gently took her arm and led her toward a group of businessmen. "Just focus on what you do best," he said. "Work." "Challenge me," Alice said. Alice didn't have time to respond. They were already standing in front of a small group of important people. Arthur greeted them casually. Alice watched closely as he became the center of the conversation. He spoke confidently, keeping control of each interaction as if he were playing an invisible game of chess and predicting everyone's moves. It didn't take long for Alice to realize he was testing her again. Every time someone mentioned a strategic point about the company, Arthur glanced. She smiled, not taking her eyes off the crowd around them. "It's not every day I'm the center of attention without meaning to." Arthur gently took her arm and led her toward a group of businessmen. "Just focus on what you do best. Work. Challenge me." Alice didn't have time to respond. They were already standing in front of a small group of important people. Sideways at Alice, waiting for her to intervene. At first, she hesitated. Soon she figured out what he wanted. Her to show her worth. She joined in. "The market has been unstable lately," one of the businessmen commented. "True." Alice agreed, grabbing a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. "But instability also opens the door for innovation. Companies that know how to navigate." She smiled, not taking her eyes off the crowd around them. It's not every day I'm the center of attention without meaning to. Arthur gently took her arm and led her toward a group of businessmen. Just focus on what you do best. She raised an eyebrow. Work. Challenge me. Alice didn't have time to respond. They were already standing in front of a small group of important people. Tough times are the ones that come out stronger. The businessmen looked at her. Surprised. That's a bold perspective. Arthur just smiled slightly. Pleased. That's why she's by my side. Alice felt a shiver run down her spine at those words. The way he said it in front of everyone sounded more personal than it should have. But she ignored the feeling and stayed focused on the conversation. The night continued with more interactions. Negotiations. And, of course, more speculation about her presence there. Alice was used to being the subject of rumors. She knew this was different at some point. Arthur stepped away to talk to an investor. Alice took the chance to get some fresh air on the balcony. The cool night breeze was a welcome relief. Running away was a familiar feeling. She smiled, not taking her eyes off the crowd around them. It's not every day I'm the center of attention without meaning to. Arthur gently took her arm and led her toward a group of businessmen. Just focus on what you do best. She raised an eyebrow. Work. Arthur smiled. Challenge me. Alice didn't have time to respond. They were already standing in front of a small group of important people. A voice came from behind her. Alice turned around and saw David Lancaster leaning against the wall, holding a glass of whiskey. Just getting some air, she replied, crossing her arms. David studied her for a moment before smiling. You did well tonight. I always do. He chuckled softly. I like your confidence. Alice narrowed her eyes. You're not here just to compliment me. Are you? David took a sip of his whiskey. She smiled, not taking her eyes off the crowd around them. It's not every day I'm the center of attention without meaning to. Arthur gently took her arm and led her toward a group of businessmen. Just focus on what you do best. Work. Challenge me. Alice didn't have time to respond. They were already standing in front of a small group of important people. Arthur took a sip of his whiskey before responding. Just curious. You and Arthur are close. Alice kept her polite smile. Her tone was firm. We're professionals. David tilted his head slightly. And do you believe that? Before Alice could answer, she felt a presence beside her. Arthur had appeared out of nowhere. His expression slightly dark. Is there a problem? Lancaster. David smiled. Always calm. No. She smiled, not taking her eyes off the crowd around them. It's not every day I'm the center of attention without meaning to. Arthur gently took her arm and led her toward a group of businessmen. Just focus on what you do best. She raised an eyebrow. Work. Challenge me. Alice didn't have time to respond. They were already standing in front of a small group of important people. Just having a friendly chat. Arthur shot him a cold look. Alice doesn't need your insinuating questions. Of course. I don't want to intrude where I'm not welcome. He gave one last glance at Alice before walking away. Arthur, however, stayed still beside her, watching David disappear into the crowd. Be careful with him, he murmured. Alice crossed her arms. I can take care of myself. Arthur turned to face her. I know, she said. But that doesn't mean I won't step in when necessary. Alice felt her heart race. There was something in his tone. The way his dark eyes were locked on hers. That made her catch her breath. A moment. Neither of them said anything. The tension between them was almost. "I can take care of myself." Arthur turned to face her. "I know. That doesn't mean I won't step in when necessary." Alice felt her heart race. There was something in his tone. The way his dark eyes were locked on hers. That made her catch her breath. A moment. Neither of them said anything. The tension between them was almost tangible. Alice knew she was stepping into dangerous territory. At that moment she couldn't stop what came next. "Why did you choose me for this?" she asked. Her voice quieter than she intended. Arthur took a step forward, closing the distance between them even more. "Because you intrigue me." Alice felt her heart skip a beat. "You." Alice knew she was entering dangerous territory. She couldn't stop what was about to happen. "Why did you choose me for this?" she asked. Her voice quieter than she intended. Arthur took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "Because you intrigue me." Alice felt her heart skip a beat. "You like to test me?" Arthur raised an eyebrow, a smile playing on his lips. "Maybe," he said. "But that doesn't mean I don't like the answer." Alice felt a warmth rise in her chest. "This feels like more than just a business game." Arthur leaned in slightly, his eyes fixed on hers. "And what if it is?" Alice opened her mouth to respond. Was interrupted. "Arthur. I'm not going to let you win." He raised an eyebrow, a smile playing on his lips. "But that doesn't mean I don't like the answer." Alice felt a warmth rise in her chest. "This feels like more than just a business game." Arthur leaned in slightly, his eyes fixed on hers. "And what if it is?" Alice opened her mouth to respond. Was interrupted by the master of ceremonies announcing Arthur's name for the stage. He didn't move immediately. He kept staring at her for a few seconds, as if waiting for something. Finally, he took a deep breath, stepped back, said softly, "Don't go anywhere." Then he walked toward the stage. Alice stayed there, trying to catch her breath. After the master of ceremonies announced Arthur's name, he didn't immediately go on stage. He kept staring at her for a few seconds, as if waiting for something. Finally, he took a deep breath, stepped back, said softly, "Don't go anywhere." Then, he walked toward the stage. Alice stayed there, trying to catch her breath. She knew that after tonight, nothing would be the same. Maybe she didn't want it to be. Alice stayed on the balcony, trying to collect her thoughts as she watched Arthur walk onto the stage. The surroundings seemed to continue normally. Guests were talking, toasting, exchanging smiles, making business promises. But inside her, something had shifted. Arthur Foster never said anything without a reason. He never acted without strategy. But what had happened between them on that balcony didn't feel like just a calculation. It felt real. That was exactly what scared her. His speech began. Alice noticed that, despite how naturally he spoke, his posture it was different. There was something in his gaze and tone that made it clear he was thinking about something else. That other place was exactly where she was. After Arthur finished speaking, a pause filled the hall. He stepped down from the stage with the same calm, calculated attitude he always had. Instead of blending in with the crowd, he greeted the investors and business people, His eyes scanned the room until they found hers. Alice felt her heart race. She knew she should look away. Pretend it wasn't happening. She couldn't. Arthur walked toward her without hurry. As if he already knew there was nowhere to run. When he got close enough, he stopped beside her. She grabbed 2 glasses of champagne from a passing waiter. He handed one to Alice, who took it without thinking. "You didn't listen," he murmured, glancing at her sideways. Alice raised an eyebrow. "Listen. I told you not to go anywhere." She let out a short laugh. "I'm still here. Aren't I?" Arthur took a sip of his champagne. He looked at her in a way that made her feel like he was examining her completely. "You are." The silence between them was uncomfortable. Alice noticed it wasn't bad anymore. It was inevitable. She wasn't sure if she wanted to fight it. Arthur reached out his hand. She hesitated for a second before accepting. He led her out of the hall, passing the guests without caring about their curious glances. When they reached the outside of the building, Alice finally spoke. "If you want to test me, you've already gotten all the answers you needed." Arthur turned to her and crossed his arms. "This isn't a test." She stared at him defiantly. "Then what is it?" Arthur asked, taking a step forward to get closer to her. "You really don't understand." His tone was low and intimate. Alice felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" Arthur asked, watching her for a moment before sighing and running a hand through his hair, as if he were thinking about what to say. "I've never had anyone challenge me the way you do. I've never had someone face me and understand me at the same time." Alice blinked, surprised. "You're saying that?" Arthur gave a crooked smile. "I'm saying that you disarmed me." Alice opened her mouth to respond. No words came out. She never expected to hear something like that from Arthur Foster. Arthur wasn't the type of man to admit weaknesses. There he was, saying exactly that. In the worst part, she felt the same. She crossed her arms, trying to ignore the lump in her throat. "Arthur. This can't happen." He tilted his head slightly. "Because we work together. People are already speculating. This could complicate everything." Arthur just smiled in a strange way. "Since when do you fear challenges?" Alice took a deep breath, feeling angry. "You always do this. You always make me angry." Arthur nodded. "Always. You want me to give in. I want you to stop pretending you haven't already given in." Alice felt her heart race. She wanted to deny it. She knew she was wrong. She also knew he was right. In that moment, she felt like she had lost this battle a long time ago. Then, without thinking, she made a decision. She took a step forward and stood on her toes, capturing Arthur's lips in what was meant to be a quick kiss. Arthur just wanted to show her something. What started as a sudden move quickly turned into something more. Arthur held her face firmly, pulling her closer and deepening the kiss in a way that made Alice lose her breath. It was intense, full of everything they had been avoiding for so long. When they finally pulled away, Alice was speechless. Arthur smiled slightly and ran his thumb across her face. So Alice took a deep breath. "I still think this is a terrible idea," she said. "Probably," he replied. "But I like challenges," she said. "I know," he replied. "May the best one win," she said, intertwining her fingers with his. Arthur smiled slightly, running his thumb across her face. Alice took a deep breath. I still think this is a terrible idea. Probably, Arthur replied. But I like challenges. Arthur chuckled softly. I know, Alice said, looking at him for a moment before intertwining her fingers with his. Then may the best one win. Arthur squeezed her hand and pulled her closer. I've already won, Alice said. And this time? Arthur replied. She didn't argue because deep down she knew he was right. Time passed faster than Alice expected. What started as a game of teasing between her and Arthur Foster had turned into something much bigger. They weren't just boss and assistant anymore. They were partners. Challenging and growing with each other every day. Arthur remained the demanding, ruthless CEO in business. With Alice, there was a connection that no one else saw. He didn't need to say anything. It was in his eyes. In how he protected her without saying a word. He always made sure she had coffee ready in the morning and always surprised her. 1 year after that night at the gala event, Arthur decided it was time to truly surprise her. It was a Saturday night. Alice had just finished work. She was exhausted. She wanted to get home. Then she got a message from him, Arthur. Meet me at the helipad. She was suspicious. She went to the top of the Foster Enterprise building when the elevator doors opened. She felt a shiver at the sight before her, soft lights. Arthur made her dependent on him. He made sure she had coffee ready in the morning. He surprised her. 1 year after that night at the gala, Arthur decided to truly surprise her. It was a Saturday night. Alice had just finished work. She was exhausted. The helipad was illuminated, reflecting off the surrounding building glass. A path of rose petals led her to the center, where Arthur waited. He was dressed in an elegant black suit. He had a small smile on his face. She crossed her arms, pretending to be suspicious, though her racing heart couldn't keep up with the act. What are you plotting? Arthur stepped forward and reached out his hand to her. Just come with me, he said. Alice hesitated for a moment before accepting. The wind blew around them. The lights of New York created a magical scene. Arthur asked, what's going on? He held her hands. His eyes locked with hers. Since I met you, my life has never. She had been used to having absolute control over everything, playing by the rules she had set. Then you showed up. Alice felt a lump in her throat. Arthur smiled, shaking his head. You've challenged me from day one. You tested me, irritated me, made me laugh, made me realize I've never really been alive until I met you. You. Alice blinked. Feeling her eyes burn, Arthur knelt in front of her, holding a velvet box in his hands. Time seemed to stop. I could spend my whole life trying to find someone who challenges me the way you do. The truth is, there's no one like you. I don't want to look for anyone else. He opened the box, revealing a sparkling diamond ring. Alice Evans, will you marry me? Alice brought her hands to her mouth. Her eyes filled with tears. She had never imagined Arthur Foster kneeling to anyone. To her. Her heart screamed the answer before her mind could even process it. Yes. Arthur smiled and slid the ring onto her finger. Her finger. Before she could say anything else, he pulled her into a passionate kiss, full of emotions that words couldn't express. The wind swirled around them. The city lights shone as if the universe was celebrating with them. Alice knew in that moment that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Do you love me, Foster? Arthur decided to take away her independence. As he always made sure she had coffee ready in the morning. In some way. He always surprised her. 1 year after that night at the gala event, Arthur decided it was time to truly surprise her. It was a Saturday night. Alice had just finished work. She was exhausted. Murmured against his lips. Arthur laughed. Do I need to say it? Yes. He cupped her face. Looking directly into her eyes. I love you, Alice. More than anything. She smiled. Feeling like the luckiest person in the world. I love you. Too. Arthur. Then. As if destiny had been waiting for that moment. Fireworks exploded in the sky. Painting the sky with colors. The city was filled with vibrant colors. It was the beginning of something even more amazing. 3 months later. The wedding took place. It was as grand as any event Arthur Foster would organize. Alice, however, made sure to add personal touches. She wanted it to be about them. About the unlikely love they had built through so many challenges. The event took place in a beautiful garden filled with white flowers and soft lighting that created a magical atmosphere. They were important guests. Also loved ones, the people who had truly been part of their journey. Arthur, dressed in a perfect tuxedo, stood at the altar. Observing every detail with the he always made sure she had coffee ready in the morning and always surprised her. 1 year after that night at the gala, Arthur decided it was time to truly surprise her. It was a Saturday night. Alice had just finished work. She was exhausted. Arthur gave her the same attention he gave any big business deal. When Alice appeared, nothing else mattered. She walked down the aisle in an elegant white dress. Her hair delicately styled. A smile that made his heart race. Arthur wasn't a man who got emotional easily. In that moment, he felt a lump in his throat. She was without a doubt the most precious thing he had ever had in his life. Alice smiled when she saw him there, waiting for her. Knew she had never been so sure of a choice before. When she finally reached the altar, Arthur took her hand. Pulled her closer. You look beautiful, he whispered. I know, she teased. Winking at him. Arthur chuckled softly. The officiant began the ceremony. Everything felt like a dream. When it was time for the vows, Arthur held Alice's hand firmly. Looked directly at her. I'm not a man who believes in the game destiny. You made me change my mind. I used to think I had control over everything. I thought I knew exactly where my life was heading. Then you showed up and turned everything upside down. I've never been so grateful for that. Alice felt a tear slide down her face. You taught me that love isn't a game of power. A partnership. I want to spend the rest of my life being your partner. Alice took a deep breath before she began. I never imagined that an annoying, arrogant boss could turn into the love of my life. You surprised me, Arthur. Just like you always do. You challenged me. Made me grow. Most importantly, made me happy. Arthur squeezed her hand. I promise to keep challenging you every day. She added, I'm counting on that. He whispered, smiling. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, Arthur wasted no time. He pulled Alice into his arms and kissed her. With all the intensity he felt. The guests applauded. In that moment, there was only each other. As they pulled away, Arthur whispered in her ear. You always say I like to win. This time we both won. Alice smiled, wrapping her arms around his neck. Forever. Together. They walked into the start of a new life. What did you think of Alice and Arthur's story? Leave your thoughts in the comments. On a scale of 0 to 10. What rating would you give this story? Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to stay updated on all our stories. Be sure to check out more touching stories by clicking here on the final screen.